Let's talk about the story of one book, the Bible, in one country, Egypt. But this is so much more than just a story about translation. It's really about a centuries-long battle between two different versions of the exact same language. You've got the sacred, scholarly language on one side, and the lively, everyday language of the street on the other. And it all kicks off with a really simple but incredibly powerful question. And that right there, that's the heart of the whole thing. If your goal is to get a message out to as many people as possible, what do you do when the very language you're using becomes a barrier? This single question has pretty much shaped the entire fascinating history of the Bible in Egypt. So to really get what's going on, you've got to meet the two main players in our story. Okay, so on one side, you have Fusha, which is classical Arabic. Think of this as the formal, high and mighty language of literature, official religion, the academic stuff. It's beautiful, it's respected, and it's the standard across the entire Arab world. But then, on the other side, you have Amiya. That's the Egyptian colloquial dialect. This is the language people actually speak, at home, in the market, with their friends, and they are so different they can feel like totally separate languages. And for a book that's supposed to be for everybody, well, that's a huge problem. To really understand how we got here, we've got to jump at a time machine and go back more than 1,000 years, back to a time when Egypt didn't even speak Arabic. The Christian church there spoke Coptic, which was the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language. But a massive historical shift was just around the corner. And what's just wild is how this all went down. It was this super slow burn, and then bam, everything changed. After the Arab conquest in the 7th century, Christians actually resisted using Arabic for almost 200 years. But by the 9th century, it was a necessity. You needed it for government jobs, just to get by. Then, in the 11th century, the whole process just went into overdrive. And within just a few generations, Coptic was gone as a living, spoken language. The church had no choice but to adapt, which is what created the need for an Arabic Bible in the first place. All right, let's fast forward to the 19th century, because this is where the modern part of our story really kicks off. We're talking about a hugely ambitious project to create one single definitive Arabic Bible for the entire Middle East. And this version, well, it would set the standard for more than 150 years.
This whole thing was the vision of an American missionary named Dr. Eli Smith, and his goal was massive: create one pure translation in classical Fusha Arabic that could be used by everyone, from Syria all the way down to Sudan. The mission wasn't just about translating a book, it was about building the foundation for an entire Christian literature for the Arab world.
And the thing is, the results, which was finished in 1865 by Cornelius Van Dyck after Smith passed away, it was an absolute masterpiece. The Smith-Van Dyck Bible is linguistically stunning. It's theologically precise. It became the gold standard. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. For the average person in Egypt, it might as well have been written in a foreign language. I mean, just to give you an idea of how big this gap was, the Bible Society of Egypt eventually had to start printing editions with a glossary in the back, a glossary of over 3,000 archaic words, just so people could figure out what they were reading. The book that was meant for everyone literally needed its own dictionary just to be understood. So you can feel this tension bubbling under the surface, right? The standard Bible was deeply respected, but it just wasn't accessible. And the first person to really challenge this standard wasn't a theologian or a church leader. Nope, it was someone you'd never expect. Okay, so get this. Meet Sir William Wilcox. He was a British civil engineer who came to Egypt to work on things like dams and irrigation canals. But he saw a different kind of dam, a linguistic one. He truly believed that forcing people to read and write in a formal language they didn't even speak at home was holding back the entire country's creativity and spirit. And he decided he was going to do something pretty radical about it. Wilcox was powered by this really potent theological idea called incarnational translation. And the idea behind it, when you break it down, is actually pretty profound and simple. The logic goes like this. If the divine word became human in the person of Jesus, then the written word should also take on the flesh of a regular person's everyday language. It should sound like the people it's for. Okay, nothing shows the difference better than this. Just look at this one verse from the Gospel of Luke. The classical Van Dyck Bible uses this really formal, kind of dusty word, tahallelu, for rejoice. But Wilcox, in his colloquial translation, used a common Egyptian saying, tiru minil farah, which literally means fly out of joy. It's the difference between a formal command and an explosion of pure joy. It's alive. And this whole debate, it goes way,
way deeper than just vocabulary or style. It cuts right to the heart of the text, down to the single most important name in the New Testament. How do you translate the name Jesus for different people in the Arab world?
Believe it or not, this one choice is loaded with theological meaning. For centuries, Arab Christians have used the name Yasu, which comes directly from the Hebrew Yeshua and means savior. It keeps that biblical identity intact. But some newer translations, especially ones created for a Muslim audience, use Isa, which is the name for Jesus you find in the Quran. The idea is to build a bridge of familiarity, but a lot of Christians worry that it blurs the lines and confuses the very distinct biblical picture of Jesus. So you can see, the stakes are just incredibly high.
Okay, so we've got this tug-of-war that's been going on for over a century, the formal versus the colloquial. And for a long time, it felt like an either-or choice. But today, here in the 21st century, technology is finally offering a way to say, hey, why not both? It's embracing every level of the language to reach all kinds of people in all kinds of ways.
I mean, just look at what the Bible Society of Egypt, the biggest Arabic Bible publisher in the world, is doing now. It's brilliant. They still print and honor the classical Van Dyck Bible, of course, but they're also launching mobile apps with audio Bibles and pop-up definitions. They've got a full comic book version of the Gospel of Mark, written entirely in modern colloquial Arabic, and even interactive Bible adventures for kids. They're using the right language for the right audience on the right platform.
But you know, if you're looking for the true modern heir to William Wilcox's incarnational vision, you've got to go online. The Bible Project, which is this amazing animated explainer series, has created an entire channel dedicated to breaking down the Bible in the Egyptian colloquial dialect.
And they're not just translating words on a page. We're talking about huge, complex ideas. They have entire series on the Torah, deep dives into theological themes like Messiah and holiness, and guides on how to even read the Bible, all of it in the Cairo dialect. This is making really deep biblical scholarship incredibly accessible to a young, digitally native generation in the language they actually think and dream in.
So, after all this, where are we? Well, the classical Fuchsia text is still there. It's that revered anchor of the formal church service, a powerful symbol of tradition. But at the same time, the colloquial Amya is having this incredible new life in comics, apps, and animated videos, making sure the story connects with a whole new generation. The tension hasn't really gone away. It's just become this dynamic, creative force.
And it really all boils down to this one big question. For a sacred text to be truly alive, not just some historical artifact on a shelf, does it have to be able to communicate in the everyday language of its people? The ongoing story of the Bible in Egypt seems to suggest that the answer isn't simple, but it is a powerful reminder of how deeply connected language, culture, and faith really are.